What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another TTS 40k tutorial video. In my previous video, I talked about the mods you needed to play 40k on Tabletop Simulator, as well as how to install them and create an army. And today, what we're going to be talking about are using all of the tools that are necessary to actually play. If you haven't installed Tabletop Simulator already, please go check that video out. But otherwise, let's get into this one. So we are in the Force Org mod right now. I discussed this one in the previous video, and we have created an army. This is a 40k combat patrol from my Getting Started series. Now, what Yellowscribe does is that it will spawn all of the models in your army, but it will also add a bunch of additional scripting to them. Once your army has been Yellowscribed, you can see that when you mouse over them, a tooltip pops up with their datasheet stats. So you can see things like their remaining wounds, equipped weapons, special rules, and if you use the keys on your numpad, you can access some additional scripting tools that have been assigned to these models that will make your games much easier. This includes the numpad 1 button, which will bring up a full data sheet for that model. This is actually just sort of a separate window, so you can also move this around. In this view, you can also see these colors down at the bottom of the screen. Selecting one of these colors will apply a highlight of that color to our unit. So let's say, for example, we want to make all of our units different. We can make a purple squad, a green squad, and an orange squad. In addition, this coloration can also be used to check your unit's coherency. This is a little buggy because it won't necessarily pay attention to the exact size of your unit. So if you have attached characters and things, they won't automatically be assigned to that unit. But if you right-click on the model, you can see this toggle coherency tab. As long as that tab is on, anytime that a model leaves coherency, so leaves 2 inches of the rest of the unit, it will actually pop up with a red highlight. So you can double check that your models are always within 2 inches of each other, which is kind of nice. And then once we slot him back in there, you can see that it will turn back to green or whatever color we have these guys scripted at versus the red color that we have when we're out of coherency. Again, this one is pretty useful in the early game if you're deploying and things, but once you start removing models from the battlefield and if you add additional characters and things, it's not quite as useful because you don't necessarily have 5 models or the remaining number of models in your unit, and the tool doesn't necessarily check for all that. In addition, the other numpad buttons can do some additional things. If we use numpad 2 and 3, we can change the remaining wounds on our model. Numpad 2 reduces the amount of wounds assigned to that model, so we can see that that number in the tooltip is going down. Numpad 3 puts them back up if you have to heal them, and we can see once we mouse over these models that you can tell how many wounds a model has remaining. Now, this is a question I get fairly often, but if you want to check something like a deep strike denial zone or an aura from your models, you can use numpad 4 or 5 to create an aura around it, measuring up to whatever distance. So, for example, let's say we have a character with an aura. Let's say we have an enhancement on our Gravis Captain here who gives him a 6-inch aura, and we can put a 6-inch circle around him at all times so we can make sure that our units remain within those 6 inches. Numpad 5 will then reduce the size of that aura. This is especially good if you want to see where enemies can deep strike around you. You can create 9-inch auras around your models, so you can make sure that enemies can't come in that area when you are positioning your models around the table. Now, if for whatever reason the shape of the miniature is different than the aura that the tool is projecting, you could use numpad 6 to cycle through several shapes. Most of the time this will be correct, but sometimes Yellowscribe assigns you a different base size than your model actually has, and you can change this. Numpad 6 and 7 will cycle through the different base sizes, so if you have to go back through the opposite direction, you can use the opposite number. This also helps to approximate aura measurements from hull measuring units like vehicles and things like that. Speaking of that, we also have a square measurement option by using the numpad 8 key. This is especially good for things like vehicles, so we can measure a nice square distance from them if they have a square hull. Obviously, this won't be something that we're using for most round-based models, so you can set that back to the round measurement with the numpad 8 key. If you want to change any of these scripting hotkeys, you can do so in the Controls tab of the main menu. You just scroll down to the bottom here, and they're under the scripting keystrokes, so you can rebind any of them that you want to. Just keep in mind that this will change any scripted action, so not just your Yellowscribe controls, but it will do so for
all scripting inputs for any mods that you play on Tabletop Simulator.
Now we're going to load into the FTC map base. This is the classic board that TTS 40k games are largely played on, and includes a ton of accessories and tools for making your games of TTS 40k way easier and way faster. Now I know there are several map bases that are available for Tabletop Simulator. I personally haven't used any of the other ones besides the FTC base, so I don't know too much about them, but I know that for the most part they have largely the same functionality with maybe some different accessories. In the future I may talk about some of the other options that there are around, but personally I don't really know much about them at the time of recording. Once we load into the map base, you're going to choose a color, either red or blue. That will sit you on either the left or right side of the table. We're going to choose red over here, and that's going to bring up this option to choose your table size. You can cycle through different table sizes if you're playing different game modes. Combat Patrol modes are usually played on a half-size table, whereas Onslaught modes are usually played on a double-size table. Most of the time you're going to be playing on this 44x60, and we're going to go ahead and click Confirm for Gaming. There's a Confirm for Map Making button here. That is if you want to construct maps, and it will remove a bunch of the access functionality that you don't necessarily need. So we're going to click Confirm for Gaming, and then we're going to load in a map. We're going to do that by going to our Games folder. In the Workshop section here, if you have subscribed to a map on Steam, you can navigate to that file, go up to the Options button here, and click Additive Load. We're going to additive load in this one. This is from the T5S2 map pool for Season 9, and you can see that it will just load right on top of that board. Now, once that's done, we're going to click Confirm Terrain, and that's going to lock that in. If we ever want to remove this, we can come over to this side menu here. This is a terrain menu, and we can click Delete Terrain, and it will just get rid of the terrain on the board. If you ever want to change what the board looks like, and you can do so once you have loaded in your terrain, you can go ahead and actually copy and paste an image URL from online into this field, or you can select one of the pre-generated maps that is already available. It doesn't really have any functional difference, it's just what you like the look of. Let's go ahead and go with this one for now. That one kind of matches the vibe. Now with that, we're going to load our army in. Let's go to Object and Saved Objects. If you have saved your army as an object, which you should have if you followed the instructions in my first video, we can just spawn that in right here, and we are ready to get playing. Now let's talk for a moment about the basic Tabletop Simulator controls themselves that you're going to need while piloting your camera around to actually play the game. Importantly, you can move your camera either with the WASD keys or by holding down your middle mouse button and clicking around the screen. You can rotate your camera by right-clicking like this, and you can select objects, pick them up by left-clicking, and if you click and drag on an empty space of the map, then you can box select several objects all at once. Now, not all objects are selectable in this way. If an object is locked, it will be selectable. And you can lock an object by mousing over it and either right-clicking and hitting the lock toggle, or by holding L over it while you're moused over it. This can be useful in some situations if you want to keep an object in a particular position while moving other things around it, or selecting other things around it. In some cases, too, it can be helpful for measuring really weird measurements. You can also rotate the camera with the arrow keys as well. Now, if we have dragged selected several objects, we can left-click on them to pick them all up and move them around as a group. If you shake them, they will end up sort of collapsing into this one ball here, but we can quickly undo that by either pressing Escape, which will return all held objects back to their original position. This is very useful if you want to, for example, just see how far a movement is going, decide you don't want to take that movement, and press Escape to return back to your original position. However, once you have picked up and dropped an object, pressing Escape will just bring up the menu. So make sure that you only do this while you're still holding on to the object. In addition, if we use the number line keys, so not the number pad, this is the line that's up above the letter keys on your keyboard, you can actually select a formation for the objects. So, for example, if we want to arrange them into a single row of models, we press the number line number 1. If we want to arrange them into 2 rows, we will press number 2, 3 is number 3, 4 is number 4, and 5 is like that. That's especially useful for arranging large units of models. So if you have big units of 20 models, for example, you can very quickly arrange them in formation that way. It's also useful just in case you do end up jumbling your models out, you can still sort of rearrange them back into some semblance of a formation. Now, in addition, let's talk about measuring your movement and measuring between different models. There is a toggle that's available to all models, which you can enable if you so desire. This is the measure movement toggle, and it will always measure the distance that your model moves while you are holding it. One thing to keep in mind is that every time you pick up a model in TTS, it will always raise 1 inch above the table surface. So actually, it will give you a little bit of a false measurement if you are constantly measuring with it. However, you could use both left and right click to set your held object to the surface of the board. So that will give you a little bit more accurate of a measurement. Now, I find this kind of distracting, so I actually don't use measure movement. Instead, I use what's called tab measurement. That just means that while you're picking up a miniature, if you want to measure the distance from its starting position, you just hold tab and it will pop up with that measurement for you. Now, you can change your measurement settings in the line menu up at the top left-hand corner right here. One thing you can do to sort of get around that weirdness, well, the game will measure the angle of your model into the air, is actually enable 2D measurement using this button right here. If you're on 2D measurement, as you'll see, it will only ever measure the distance that model has moved horizontally across the surface of the table. This is probably the easiest way to measure models, unless you're doing something like moving up and down terrain features, in which case it probably makes sense to use the more flexible measurement options. But as long as you're just playing a standard game of 40k where you're moving across the two-dimensional surface of the board, that is much easier. Now, with all those tools out of the way, let's talk about rolling some dice. The FTC map base includes a dice rolling tool built in. Now, the dice roller is this little cardboard box in the corner of the tool right here. And in order to roll dice, there's 2 ways you can do it. You can select your dice and place them into the roller. You can see that they kind of snap into it, and then it will roll them and output your results onto this sheet. Or you can click the Roll All Dice button, which will select all of the dice on the sheet and put them all into the dice roller altogether. Doing it manually is a little bit easier if you are only rolling certain numbers of them. For example, if we're re-rolling particular dice or particular dice results, then selecting them is a little bit easier than rolling all the dice. But if we have a bunch of dice that we've all just spawned, just clicking Roll All Dice will put them all into the dice box altogether. Over on the output here, you can see the number of each number that you rolled on the dice facing, and you can see the total number of dice as well as the sum of their results together if that is important for you. Now, these little buttons are very important because they make the process much easier. You can delete specific rows of dice from the dice roller as well as re-roll specific rows of dice. For example, if we're saying that we only hit on a 3 or higher, we want to delete our results below a 3 before going to our next step in our attack sequence. If we wanted to save some time there, we could right-click this delete button to delete that row and all rows below it. So let's say in this case we hit on 4s, so we want to delete all of our dice that are below a 4. So we will just right-click on this delete button and it will delete all of those rows. If we want to reverse this, we can click this button and it will then start to delete all of the dice of that row and above instead. But generally speaking, this is much easier because 40k is a game that you're trying to roll higher numbers. A lot of times you're getting rid of your lower numbers. We just want to be using it on the target number and below to make things a little bit easier. Now, if we're going to put another roll in here, if we have re-rolls, for example, we're a Space Marine player, we're attacking our Oath of Moment target, we can reroll our hit rolls against it and we hit on a 3+. You can do the same thing with this white button, this roll button. If we click on one row of dice, it will reroll all of the dice in that row. So if we have a reroll 1s to hit or 1s to wound result, for example, we can click that row and it will reroll them. Or if we want to reroll all of those results and below, we can right click on it and it will reroll all of them for us right there. If for whatever reason the order in which your dice are rolled matters, you can use the ordered roll button here to roll them all in a string. This is especially important for things like saving throws. If, for example, you have a unit with multiple different save characteristics, let's say we have our Blade Guard veterans and we have a character attached into them. The character might have a 2+ armor save thanks to an enhancement, but the Blade Guard veterans don't. We're going to take all of our wounds on the Blade Guard veterans first, then we're going to take some wounds on the character. So we're going to roll the 3+ save on the Blade Guard veterans. We'll see how many we fail. It looks like this guy would take 1 wound. wound. He would then die. 2 wounds would be taken on the next guy. He would then die. And then the last guy would finally die to those attacks. After that, we're taking these on 2+ saves, and the character would be able to tank all of those remaining numbers just fine. If you are taking them, especially on things like a Feel No Pain, for example, you are a 2-wound model receiving 2 damage receiving 2 damage attacks, and you have a Feel No Pain to try to protect yourself, you can use this in 2 or in 3 button, and then it will split that result into groupings of that number. So, for example, if our unit is receiving 2 damage attacks and is trying to ignore them with a Feel No Pain, let's say it's a 5+ Feel No Pain, we would roll 1 set of these for each 2 damage attacks. So this guy would fail, he would die, the next guy would take 1 damage, he would then die to the next attack, the next guy would be able to save 1 damage, he would then die to the next attack, and the same thing goes on throughout the remainder of the sequence. So once you get into a little bit more complicated attack activations, these become incredibly important. Now, we can also change the color of the dice that we use. I usually do this systematically for if I have an army that matches that color. Clicking the white or black option will change the pips on the dice. So you'll get the black option gets this model with these black pips and sort of squared edges. The white model is the round edges with the white pips. Those don't functionally matter. It's entirely aesthetic preferences. And you can also choose a custom color for your dice. So for example, if I wanted to use these purple dice instead, I could click on that for custom dice. And then once I clicked the buttons, it would spawn the purple dice instead of whatever I had selected otherwise. That's nice to do if you have a particular style of dice that you want, although most players will just use the presets that are available inside this dice roller. Now I'm going to turn on my chat here in my configuration menu and apply to that. We can see that pop in over on the left-hand corner. If you want to see your dice results, the game will typically export your results to this little corner back here, and if we click last roll, we can see the roll that we made previously. So for example, you roll some dice and then you accidentally delete them by clicking clear mat, for example. We can still go back and see our last roll, which is saved in the system, to verify what we got. If you click last 5 rolls, it will show you the last 5 sets of dice that were rolled through the dice rollers. Now, down in the bottom corner over here, we can see a little dice camera. Now, this is an in-game camera that's actually focused on the dice roller, and this little viewer right here just shows you what is going on the other side of the table. So for example, if we see that we roll these dice over here, we can see that that's reflected over in the dice roller. This is a little bit easier because it allows both you and your opponent to see what's going on with your opponent's dice while you're rolling on each other's side of the table. Now, generally speaking, people don't have a problem if you roll on their side of the table, you roll the dice in their dice roller, because realistically, they're all going to roll the same anyway. But this is just nice if you and your opponent are both rolling on each other's separate dice rollers. Now, with that all being said, let's talk about actually how to play a game of 40k. Now, we haven't actually begun the game yet. What we want to do is, once we've loaded everything in and gotten our terrain set up, we want to choose what game mode we're playing. Leviathan is a outdated game format using the Leviathan mission deck. Parea Nexus at the time of recording is the current, especially competitive mode format, but there is an option to play the older mode if you want to, and that will open up all of our secondaries and mission selections. We can click this button in our score sheet here to put our Steam username into the score sheet just for record keeping, and we can see over here that we have mission selections. Now, we can either draw cards for the different mission sets. We can draw deployment mission rule cards and primary objective cards from these decks, or we can randomize them with this button. If you click Random Games Workshop, it will actually choose one of the mission sets from the Pariah Nexus tournament pack that Games Workshop recommends that you play. And you can also cycle through them if you want to find a particular setup of these. So, for example, if we're going to play Scorched Earth Stalwarts on Search and Destroy, this is mission combination K, according to the Pariah Nexus game document. We can then go ahead and go down to our deployment zone here and click on Search and Destroy. Here we go, and that will actually spawn a deployment zone marker as well as objectives in all of the correct places. Now, there are some tools for resetting where the deployment zone and objectives end up going just for usability. For example, we have some terrain features overlapping our objectives right here, and what we can do is actually raise the height of those objectives with that plus button on the objective height toggle, and that'll let us raise and lower these objectives that are spawned in just so that we can see them through terrain. I usually like to keep my objectives objectives on the ground floor so that they don't intersect with any models' bases. But if there isn't any measurement that we have to do, just to like make sure that we can contest an objective or control it with a model that's moving into this section of the terrain feature, we can also always just raise it for a moment there while we're making that measurement. Now, the objective markers that spawn also have some controls associated with them as well. If we mouse over them, we can see this little, I don't know, 5-pointed object here, and it says 1 out of 5. These are a tool in Tabletop Simulator called states, and we can actually cycle through states by mousing over the stated object and using the number line to press a number that corresponds with a particular state, or we can right-click it and we can select the state that way. If you click this reset button here, we'll actually lock in the objective at that one state and delete all the other ones. So if there's any reason that you really don't want to be moving the objectives around, you can just use reset to keep them in this position. Now, the important things here are state 2, which shows us the actual physical 40mm object that is the physical objective marker. While these are typically used in Warhammer 40,000 to display objectives, technically the actual objective marker is only the 40mm circle, and the rest of this mat is a representation of the 3-inch distance from that circle that you need to stand into to control it. So if we use state 2, they will just display the 40mm objective. If we use state 3, it will actually display the volumetric measurement that you use to control the objective. Objectives always are controlled out to a 5-inch vertical distance as well as their 3-inch horizontal distance. This displays that. Another thing that this does, which is very nice, is actually give us a good showcase of where the objective ends up in situations where it would be a little bit difficult to see. So for example, we want to make sure that we can guard models into a corner of a ruin or something and still control the objective. We can use state 3 to just see where the walls of the objective are. State 4 and state 5 are just colored versions of the objective. These are usually used to denote when a player has locked in the objective under their control, so they used an objective secured style ability. So when the red player does so, or when the blue player does so, there's options for that as well. So we have the objectives down. Let's talk about secondary objectives. You'll see that a hand of secondary mission cards spawns in when you load into your chosen mission format. You also have a set of 2 cards here that are for tactical objectives. These are invisible to your opponent, and what you'll do is when you've selected your secondary objectives that what you want to use during the battle formation step, you'll just flip them over. Normally you want to be playing tactical objectives, so we'll flip those 2 over, and once we have made of all of our secondary selections, we're going to click the Lock in Secondaries button, and those cards are going to fly right over here to this secondaries spot. Sometimes these bug out a little bit and actually don't load in when your opponent joins. You can reset them by just clicking on them. I don't know why this works, but occasionally players will report that they loaded into a game, but they can't see the cards in their hand. If the other player just sort of selects the flipped over cards and clicks on them on their side, then they'll actually load in. TTS spaghetti code for you. I don't know why that works, but it does. Once both players have locked in their secondaries, the cards will flip over to display what the secondaries are to their opponent, and then once the game begins, these will discard themselves. I'm going to do it manually here because I'm just in a single player game, but this will all be automatic once you're in a regular game. You also have a button over here to draw secondaries, so you'll click this every turn when it comes to your time to draw secondary cards, assuming you're using tactical objectives. If you are discarding the card, whether you've completed it or you're discarding it to new orders or you are discarding it at the end of your turn, you can use the little X button to discard those cards and put them in your discard pile, and then you'll draw new cards the next turn. If you want to redraw the card because it's not scoreable or it has a clause that says you redraw it, you use a recycle secondary button, and that will shuffle it back into the deck. And it's important to note that this deck shuffles itself anytime it draws cards or reshuffles cards back in. We can see it goes through a little shuffle animation every time. So theoretically, even if you're looking into your secondary deck, this will always be random when you're drawing from it. If you're using secret missions, you can click the Prepare Secret button in order to basically do the same thing that we did with secondary missions earlier on. It will draw you your hand of secret mission cards, and you can then flip one of them over if you have elected to use a secret mission, and then click Lock in Secret. That will flip over the card over here for the remainder of the game until the end of the game, where it can flip up and you can display to your opponent what secret mission you chose. Once you start scoring your objectives, you start tracking them on this score sheet right here. You have a section for primary on each side of the table that's on the outside, and you can click the plus button to increase your score there, modifier or the minus button to decrease your score. If you right-click on any of these trackers, you'll increase the score by 5, and the same goes for decreasing it. The score sheet doesn't cap each individual secondary, so because of tactical objectives, you can have the total scored on a particular secondary track be higher than 20, which is the normal max if you have fixed secondaries that you choose at the start of the game. So that's one thing to pay attention to if you are somebody who plays fixed secondaries. However, what will happen is that the game will cap your secondary score at 40 points. So even though this would normally be 50 points, we're only having 50 points on the score tracker because it's given us 40 secondary, and then both players start with the 10 points for having a battle-ready army. Adding any additional secondary points beyond 40 doesn't actually increase your score at all, so you don't have to worry about that. And the same goes for primary score. Even if we try to give ourselves above 50 points, it will not increase that total anymore. You also have a command point tracker over here. This will automatically tick up as you cycle through turns. Once you've started the game, you'll be able to pass the turn with a toggle. Just left-click the toggle to cycle through your phases, and right-click it to pass the turn to your opponent through all the phases, and that will automatically increase your command point tracker. There's also going to be a gain a CP button, which will improve your command point tracker by 1, but it won't let you do it multiple times. So if you have multiple abilities, for example, that gain CP, you can use that button to make sure that you don't give yourself more than 1 additional CP each battle round, because obviously you are still restricted on 1 CP generated per battle round in addition to the ones that you get naturally. Now, if you want to do any measurement here, we also have some tools to make measurement easier. The Show Table Quarters button gives us a nice, easy track of table quarters, especially for engage on all fronts. Show Area Denial gives us both a 3-inch and 6-inch measurement from the center of the battlefield for the Area Denial secondary or for established locus, which is very useful. Showing Strategic Reserves and Containment gives us bands across the edges of the battlefield. Strategic Reserves can only come in wholly within 6 inches of a battlefield edge, so they're restricted to that inner band. Containment allows you to perform it if you're wholly within 9 inches of a battlefield edge, so that gives you an easy measurement for those as well. And you can click Hide on any of these to remove those measurements if you ever want to. Now, the FTC map base also comes stock with a chess clock that you can use if you want to, or if the event that you're playing in requires it. It starts at 2 hours, but you can reset it by holding down this middle button and then using these buttons to click down or up to increase or decrease the total time. I usually play on 90-minute chess clocks, so that's what we're going to do, and then click this button to cycle all the way through. Once it gets to the other side, it will match the 2 players' times, and then you can hold this button down to reset it. Now you can see that there's a little piece of the HUD up here in the top right corner that has that chess clock represented, and once we begin playing, it basically works like a chess clock does in real life. So for those who don't know, a chess clock in real life will have one side that's raised that you will tap on to send the timer to the other side, which will then raise that side and tick down the timer on that side. So for example, if we want to proverbially hit our chess clock on the blue side, it will start the red side counting, and as the red player, if we want to hit our chess clock on the red side, it will send the time over to the blue side player. And we can see that represented graphically up here in the corner. Now you can use the 7 and 9 numpads to pass the time back and forth. The 8 numpad key will actually pause the time. However, the easiest way to do this is actually just by using the little buttons in the HUD here. This functions as the chess clock, so if we were to click on one side or the other, it would send the time back and forth. So you can just click on whichever time is larger to pass the timer to the other side. The larger side is going to be ticking, but then you or the other player can click on it to pass it back to you. And that lets you accurately divide the time between the 2 players. Now with that, there are some other little accessories in here which are pretty useful. The Hide Army button creates this big red rectangle. This is a hidden zone in your side, and this is for the battle formation step when you can select reserves and transports, but you do not have to show them to your opponent. That's hidden information. So anything inside this rectangle is hidden from the other player. They can't see where you are placing those. So you can set your attached characters. You can put your units into strategic reserve, or you can put them into transports. Typically, you just use this board to indicate which zone that unit is in, whether it's in a transport or in strategic reserve. And then when you are done with that, you can click the Show Army button, and that will get rid of that hidden zone so your opponent can see where you have placed all those models. That's just a nice little quality of life thing, so your opponent can't see what you're doing. In addition, we also have these nice little tokens which are useful. This is not really something that we have to do too much, but we can click on it or right-click on it to raise or lower the number of wounds on this little wound counter. This is okay if you have your army for whatever reason not Yellowscribed, but if you have the Yellowscribe tool that we described at the beginning of the video, you don't necessarily need this. In addition, the activation token is good if you have an army with a lot of individual units and you want to make sure that you only attack or move with them one time. You can place a little activation token near a unit. Once they have shot or done their thing, you can click this button to toggle it to red. Once you move to the next phase, these buttons will automatically reset back to green. So it's a good way to track whether or not your unit has fired, for example, and then clears itself at the end of the shooting phase. Last but not least, there's also some other useful tokens in here for ongoing effects or any other things that you might have going on. These are all bags, which is a tool in Tabletop Simulator to allow you to sort of stack objects up. So you can actually click and drag on them. You can spawn an infinite number of the identical token. It's all pretty self-explanatory. These don't have any scripting involved or anything. They're just nice for reference. A little bit of a nice quality of life thing that you can do as well is use the line drawing tools over here on the top left-hand side. This is also available if you press F2 on your keyboard. This allows you to draw a line on the board. So you can, for example, determine where your line of sight could be in order to tell how many models are going to be able to see you, or pre-measure your opponent's line of sight so you can make sure you don't run into it. A lot of players do this in real life just using a laser line drawer or a tape measure, but it's obviously much easier in Tabletop Simulator. So with that, those are all of the tools for playing Warhammer 40k on Tabletop Simulator. As you can see, once you have a couple games under your belt with these, the sequence actually becomes very simple. If you want to get games of Warhammer 40k in, you can do so over on my Discord. There is a link in my link tree down in the video description. I run events weekly for Tabletop Simulator, so if you want to get tons and tons of tournament games in, we have plenty of that going on. And we also have some free play areas for players to just find games and play around in a more casual setting as well. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. If you enjoy my videos and you want to support me, please consider checking me out on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. Thanks to everybody who supports the channel. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.